attending. We've got 25 people logged on at the moment. We're expecting about 70. So I'm just going to spend a minute or two doing a little bit of housekeeping and telling you how the webinar will run, and then we'll hand over to Chris Preston, who is our guest presenter today. So quickly, just a little bit about WeedSmart. WeedSmart's an industry initiative. We receive funding from the various chemical companies, seed companies and GRDC to put together an industry message about managing herbicide-resistant weeds. So it's about awareness of herbicide resistance, and it's about management of resistant weeds, and it's really about the industry having a single consistent voice about best practice management of resistant weeds and making sure that the awareness gets out there. So this morning is a webinar which is part of that awareness and management campaign, and we're running 6 webinars throughout the year. This is webinar number 3, and this morning we have Chris Preston presenting about pre-emergent herbicides, and next week, I believe it's on Tuesday, we have Deirdre Lemurl talking about crop competition with weeds. So just a couple of little tiny bits about housekeeping. You'll have a Citrix or GoToWebinar box up on your screen there most probably. If you want to reduce that so you can see the whole screen, just click on that little orange icon with the white arrow in it. That will minimise that. And if you would like to ask questions as we go, you'll need to maximise that box, and you can type your questions into the questions box there. The way the webinar will run this morning, I will do sort of interview style a little bit. Chris will do some speaking, and then I'll interject from time to time with comments and questions. So put some questions up as we go, and I'll interject and ask Chris those questions verbally so that everyone can hear them, and then we'll answer those questions from there. Here's a couple of numbers to write down. Now, if things go pear-shaped and for some reason we fall off, you might like to write down that webinar ID, or you might like to write down Kate's mobile number there. Kate from Coccinall is helping us today host the webinar, and if things really go pear-shaped, you can try her mobile, and hopefully she might be able to fix it up for you. So we're just about getting a few more attendees on, which is good to see, and I'll give you just another second or two to write down that those numbers there before we hand over to Chris. Chris Preston is obviously one of Australia's leading scientists in weeds and herbicide-resistant weed management. He's been in the game for a very long time, based at the University of Adelaide, and leads a research team there. Chris can tell you a little bit more about himself and about the team that he leads, but particularly in the last few years, amongst many other talents, Chris has spent a lot of time focusing on pre-emergent herbicides, and there's probably nobody in the country that knows the chemistry and the science of pre-emergent herbicides better than Chris Preston. So thanks very much for joining us this morning, Chris, and I'll hand over the screen to you, and you can introduce what you're going to tell us, and as I said, I'll interject with the odd question and comment as we go.
Well, thank you, Peter, for the invitation to talk. As you say, our team at the University of Adelaide has been working on pre-emergent herbicides for quite some time now, and the reason why we've been spending so much time looking at pre-emergent herbicides is because across a lot of the cropping area we've lost our post-emergent herbicides for grass weed control, which means that we're left with pre-emergent herbicides and non-chemical control methods to manage grass weeds. And so we've been focused on 2 questions, one of which is making sure that we've got enough pre-emergent herbicides, but also looking at how do we use these compounds really effectively. We've had such a long run with post-emergent herbicides that everybody got familiar with how they worked, and I think people have kind of tended to forget a little bit about how pre-emergent herbicides work and what you need to take notice of. But also we've learnt a lot more about how these work, and some of the things that we used to think about pre-emergent herbicides are not really true anymore because we've changed our farming system so much. So this work has been largely funded by GRDC. It's involved myself, Peter Butsalis, Sam Kleeman and Gurjeet Gill, and a host of farmer group collaborators that we've worked with and consultants that we've worked with over the years. So what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time talking about background material in terms of what do we need to understand. Then I'm going to show a little bit of data and a couple of other things, and sort of kind of finish off on the issue of, well, what do you take away from this? So if you're thinking, well, how should I use these sorts of products in my environment, I'm hoping to give you a few tips and hints as to what you might be thinking about.
And I'll just interject for a second there, Chris. The listeners and the webinar attendees will notice that part of Chris's slide is missing. We just found this just before we went live, and fortunately it doesn't remove any of the important bits. So if you're seeing a bit of a block of black of his slide missing there, everybody's got that at the moment, unfortunately. But let us know by the chat box if it's a bigger problem than that. But we think, it's just appeared in full anyway, Chris. So hopefully we're right. Sorry about that, Chris. I'll hand back over to you.
Oh, I think that was actually something at my end, Peter, that I just realised there was something happening and turned it off, and I can tell you about it afterwards so the next presenter doesn't run into the same issue.
Good one.
So if we go to actually start thinking about what we need to know about pre-emergent herbicides, I've got a list on the slide here of the sort of things that we need to understand about the individual herbicides we're using. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of these in detail because we've only got an hour and I want you guys to have the ability to ask some questions. But I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on the ones towards the top there, water solubility, the binding to soil components, and moisture availability, because they are really the key things that we need to know to really get a good idea of which product do we use in which environment. But I'm going to actually start off very, very briefly just reminding you about the importance of position of the weed seed. And I think this is one of the things that's changed over our use of pre-emergent herbicides now to what happened 20 years ago. There we go. So if we think about previous history, so back in the 1990s, what tended to happen, that there was pre-sowing cultivation prior to the crop going in that killed weeds and prepared the seedbed, and most importantly what it did from our perspective was it mixed all those weed seeds through the soil profile, so that when the crop went in, the crop would be sown below the surface of the soil, but you'd have all these weed seeds scattered through that profile. And if we were trying to get those weed seeds with pre-emergent herbicides, we actually had to get the herbicide to the seed. Now, for some herbicides, that really wasn't much of a problem. So, products like Logran and Glean that were quite water-soluble, the rain would just wash the herbicide down there. But for other herbicides, that became a challenge. And so the old label for Tryfuran products was that you would work up your seedbed, spray Tryfuran, and then work the Tryfuran in before sowing. And you had to work the Tryfuran in, one, so you didn't lose it, but secondly, to get it down to where the weed seeds were. So first thing we really need to think about when we're using pre-emergent herbicides is, where are our weed seeds and where do we have to get our herbicide? So if we start looking at some of the seeding systems we have now that are very common across the country, so the most common ones, no-till with a knife point type system, or we've got increasing numbers of growers who are looking at disc seeders for various uses, and here I've illustrated the far extreme of a single low disturbance disc setup. And what we have there is that we end up with our weed seeds very, very close to the soil surface, as opposed to being distributed through that layer. And with the knife point and press wheels, we then bury those seeds within soil, and in the disc systems we tend not to. So we've actually got our weed seeds in a very different position. And to get good control of those weeds, we need to get to the herbicide in the right position. And for most of the pre-emergent herbicides we're dealing with, where we want that herbicide is at the weed seed or just below the weed seed. And this is why the current most commonly used practice with pre-emergent herbicides of putting the herbicide out in front of the seeder and then incorporating it with the sowing operation has been working so well. But equally, it's why we have some issues with that sort of practice in terms of getting all of the control of all of the weeds we want. Because if we're looking at that 9-point and press wheel system where we sow and we move that herbicide out of the furrow and onto the inner row, that's great for getting weeds on the inner row, but what everybody notices is you end up with weeds in the crop row or on the shoulder. And the weeds are there because you don't have so much herbicide there as you do on the inner row. So we need to keep this in mind when we're starting to talk about, well, how do these herbicides work and how do we get these herbicides to work in our system? So moving on and looking at some properties of these pre-emergent herbicides, here I've got a list of a number of compounds. I'm actually only going to talk about a few of them, really. There is the herbicide, and I've got common trade names for many of them. And this is just a slide of water solubility of those compounds. And that ranges a lot. So if we look down the bottom of the slide there at green, that's got really high water solubility, which means that any rainfall is going to move that into the soil profile, which is why that product works so well in the cultivated system. If we look at the other end, at products like Tryfuran and pendimethalin, they've got very low water solubility. And that essentially means that for the most part, they're going to tend to stay where they're applied. The other products have got in-between levels of water solubility, and that actually influences how well they might work. Sakura is a new herbicide. We at the University of Adelaide spent a lot of time in the development of Sakura, working with Kumei and then Bayer about that product, so we've developed a fair bit of experience about some of the downsides of it. And one of the things about Sakura is it's actually not very water soluble. It does move more than Tryfuran moves, which means that you do need rainfall after application, and that rainfall will move it down the profile a little. But if you get situations where the profile is moist and it dries on the surface and the herbicide's put out and then there's no rainfall for 2 weeks, you'll find that the weeds will grow through Sakura because it's just not being activated enough to pick up those weeds. And to give you a sense of how much water solubility it has, you can see that it's got the same solubility that Avidex has. So not a whole lot. Rustler, which is propizamide, is also fairly low water soluble compound. So one of the reasons when it's used in canola is that you'll see that it doesn't necessarily get all the weeds in the crop row, and that's because it's just not water soluble enough. And if we look at some of the other compounds, so BoxaGold, which is a combination of prosulfocarb and S-metolachlor, it's got a lot more water solubility. And that means that under marginal water conditions or marginal moisture conditions, BoxaGold is going to be a more effective product than Sakura will. But equally, under very high rainfall conditions, BoxaGold is going to give you more risk of crop damage than a product like Sakura will. So part of the matching of products is to say, well, where do I need that product? What's my rainfall pattern? And so how might I actually put those products out there?
Chris, can I
One of the things
ask
to mention about products like Tryfuran and pendimethalin.
Can I just ask a question there,
Chris?
Chris?
Say something, Peter?
Yeah,
Yes.
well, just the question that springs to mind for me is you say that Sakura, it's low water solubility, and therefore if the soil dries out, you get poor activity. Tryfuran is much lower solubility again. However, Tryfuran does seem to punch above its weight a bit in the drying soil profile. So I don't know if you're going to explain that in a coming slide, but how does that work?
No, I was actually going to explain that now, Peter, because the thing about Tryfuran and pendimethalin is actually they work differently to the other products. So the other products, where they really need to be, most of them need to be is at that seed or below the seed, so they're taken up largely by the roots or the piece of shoot right around the seed. And they're taken up in water. So you need to have enough water there to take them up. And that's part of the issue of getting peroxysulfone to work in those very dry environments. Tryfuran and pendimethalin are actually taken up as a gas. And they only need enough water to turn them into a gas. And as soon as that happens, then they can be taken up even though there's not a lot of water in the system. And that's the reason why Tryfuran tends to punch above its weight in those really dry environments.
So it's only those two,
taken up in a different way.
It's just those two that are taken up as a gas. Everything else is taken up in the soluble, dissolved in water form.
Dissolved in water. Yeah, just those two are taken up as a gas. So they behave differently. You know, they tend not to move very far, but when they turn into that gas, they're quite readily taken up.
Yep. Thank you, Chris.
The second component that we need to really get a grip on in terms of understanding these pre-emergent herbicides is their ability to bind to soil components. And here I'm just going to show you soil organic matter. And if we start with Tryfuran, I think it's a product that most people are very familiar with. We know it's got very, very high binding to organic matter, which is why if you've got a lot of stubble, you don't get a lot of activity out of Tryfuran. So if it all gets tied up on the stubble, it doesn't come off and you can't use it. If we look at some of the other compounds, and here I've got them sort of listed in their water solubility rather than changing that table around, but you look at some of these other compounds like glen and lowgran at the bottom there, they bind very low levels to soil organic matter, which means that one of the issues we have, particularly in light soils of high pH, is that those products just tend to disappear out of the profile with rainfall. So they'll get washed right down out of the profile. So in those light soils, you get your control early, and then you might notice that it disappears. Some of the other compounds have, because of their combination of relatively low water solubility and relatively low binding, can actually find that they'll move down the profile a fair bit in particular soil types. So this is a problem with compounds like Sakura, particularly in sort of lighter soils with not a lot of organic matter, is that even though they're not very water soluble, continual rainfall on them will actually move them down, and you can actually move them out of the profile in some soil types. And so sometimes you'll think that you should actually get really good control, but control early can look a bit poor, and that's because the Sakura's got too far down and you've got to wait for the weeds to get down there and pick it up. So part of this also is understanding, well, where's that product actually going to sit in that system? And some products are going to be much more user-friendly in low rainfall environments if they're in soils with low organic matter, whereas they probably won't work at all if they're in soils of high organic matter, simply because they'll just get bound up by the organic matter and won't be freely available. So that's the other side of the coin, particularly in terms of crop damage as well. So trying to understand how you're going to get these products to have crop damage. We know that Tryfuran in light soils with not a lot of organic matter, we've got to back off the rate, otherwise we get crop damage. We've seen that with some of these other products as well. So that if you're getting a lot of binding to organic matter and you don't have a lot of organic matter, you probably want to be thinking about the rate of herbicide you're using. And you'll notice on labels, particularly labels of Tryfuran and BoxaGold, that there's advice around soil types and product rates.
Chris, there's a question just come in from the audience, from Mick Brady, and it's $1 million question. How much rain do you believe Sakura does need for it to be effective?
Well, our rule of thumb around Sakura is that you probably need around 10 millimetres of rainfall in 10 days to get the best out of it after sowing. 10
mils of rain in 10 days, and you're saying that given that it's organic matter, if you then get a lot of rain, you can actually leach it too far. So 10, do you have a feeling for the upper limit of how much rain is too much?
Well, that very much depends on soil type, and I think that if you were to get an inch of rain on it in the first week in some light soil types, you might lose it.
Okay.
So where we've seen problems of efficacy in sort of two circumstances. The worst ones have been where there's been opening rain and then there's been a dry seeding start and people have gone out and it's a little dry on the top, they've gone seeding anyway. That's where it's failed mostly because it just hasn't been activated. And we've seen some failures where we've had very high rainfall in light soils on top of it, and it's probably that inch plus rainfall area where that's happened that we've seen those issues. But usually what happens in those ones is that eventually when the weeds get down to where the herbicide is, it does tend to slow them up. So we've had trials where we've had a lot of ryegrass come up after using Sakura, but when we come back at the end of the season, there's not a lot of ryegrass heads on them because the Sakura's eventually kicked in. And it's really those particularly dry situations where it's been wet underneath where Sakura's totally failed. That's the worst circumstance for it.
Yep. Thanks, Chris. And for the attendees out there, keep the questions coming. That's the best way to get the most out of these webinars. So, yeah, feel free to type some questions into the questions box as we go.
And I just want to just talk briefly about rustler there. So we've had some issues with crop damage in canola with the use of propyzamide. And what you'll notice there is that it's while it's got some high binding to organic matter, it's not quite as high as things like prosulfocarb or Avidex there. And if you get really high rainfall on top of that, we see the same sort of issue. It just moves too far down, and we end up with crop damage. Particularly as canola is nowhere near as tolerant of propyzamide compared to what wheat is of Sakura. So you've got that innate tolerance playing a role there. So, with products like Ruff, you've got to be a little bit careful in those situations where you might get very, very high rainfall after seeding, that you might just get a little bit of crop damage out of that.
Yeah, there's certainly reports from WA with a bit of damage from propyzamide in canola this year, which is ironic given it was its first year of official registration. There's another question, Chris. How does rustler behave in light soil types versus heavier textured soils?
Well, the issue with light soil types with rustler is that you're going to have less binding of it. But again, remembering it's not terribly water soluble, so it's going to be rainfall driven. You're going to have higher risk in light soils than you will in heavy soils. But one of the things that comes into this story is that it's also dependent upon when you put the herbicide out and what the conditions are. So these data here about the equilibrium position of this relationship. So this is actually after you've had the product out, there's been a bit of moisture, and it's had time to interact with the soil components. With a number of these compounds, and certainly we saw this in our trials, our canola trials last year with rustler, is that if you've gone out and it's been relatively dry and you put the product out dry and you get a very heavy fall of rain, that actually pushes the herbicide further down the profile than you might normally expect. And if you happen to be in some cracking soils, that can be actually really quite dangerous. So some of these products, have been very good dry, but under particular circumstances, going out dry and getting a very, very heavy fall of rain, you can actually get crop damage, and that's what happened to us in one of our trials with rustler last year in canola, and we had some fairly extensive crop damage out of that particular scenario. It's just one of those things. I mean, it's really hard to predict what your rainfall's going to be, so it's very, very hard to manage for that. Most of the time, I think rustler would be quite okay as a put-out dry product. It's just very occasionally you're going to get those conditions where you'll get some damage. And I think we've seen that with Sakura as well in wheat. Really high rainfall after it's gone out dry. And we know that happens with some of these other compounds. We've certainly seen it with BoxaGold, but it's a lot more water soluble, and that's what we'd expect to see.
Yep.
Okay, so I just wanted to, having talked about that, I now want to talk about some things that go wrong and why they go wrong. And these are just some photographs out of some of our trials, and I just want to talk about specifically about what we got wrong in these trials, and not particularly talk about any particular herbicide, because this can be done with any herbicide, pre-emergent herbicide we're dealing with, though some are more prone to these issues than others. So on that top one of those photographs, that's a situation where we've gone out, we've got really excellent ryegrass control out of that particular treatment there, but you can see we've done a lot of crop damage. And so that's been a circumstance where what we've done is, through our sowing system, is we haven't separated our crop seed far enough from the herbicide. So we've sown that too shallow. And we've got really good rainfall. And what that means is that we've got that herbicide down, it's activated on the weeds, so we control all the ryegrass, but it's also activated on the crop because the crop wasn't deep enough. So one of the things that can go wrong is that if you don't get that good separation between these herbicides and the crop, then you'll end up with crop damage. And we've seen that with heavy rainfall, we've seen it with shallow seeding, we've seen it where the walls of the furrow fall into the furrow because they're not, they don't hold up well enough, and product goes in on top of the crop seed, and that's when we get the worst crop damage. The photograph at the bottom is the kind of opposite scenario. That's one where we've got no crop damage. The product has worked, given us no crop damage there, but we haven't actually got any weed control. And the situation there is one where we actually didn't activate the product, and the product hasn't actually worked on the weeds. In this case, that one's actually Tryfuran, and we didn't incorporate that Tryfuran well enough with our sowing operation there, and so we ended up losing it instead of having it activated and work on the weeds. So a lot of it's making sure that we actually get that herbicide and get it in the right position to get our weeds, but not in a position where we're going to control the crop and damage the crop. So just making sure that we get that positional selectivity right. And a lot of this, getting that positional selectivity right, is about your seeding equipment, making sure you've got the right sowing equipment for the herbicide and you've got the right sowing depth. We particularly see problems with disc seeders because of a tendency that if you're going too fast that you tend to sow too shallow. So just a bit of attention to detail and getting that seeding depth right can overcome a lot of potential damage issues. So, as I said at the beginning, we've done a lot of work around how to get the best out of pre-emergent herbicides, and what I want to talk about now is some work that we're doing where we were really focusing on those very high rainfall zones. And part of the problem that we have with pre-emergent herbicides in high rainfall areas is that the weeds just keep coming up. Every time it rains, you get a new germination of weeds. Whereas in the sort of lower rainfall areas, it's much more common to get a couple of flushes and then not much after that. So we did some work where we tried to ask some questions about how do we approach this? You know, what are the various things that we can do to try and get extra weed control? And this data set is actually 6 trials that we did in collaboration with some farming systems groups across South Australia, Victoria and southern New South Wales. So quite a number of trials and a lot of people are involved in this. And I just want to just step you through the various treatments we did, why we had the treatments, why they did what they did, and what you might take away from them depending upon what environment you're in. So we'll start with Tryfuran on the left there. The thing to notice there is that we've got a very, very wide range of control. That was entirely driven by sites that had Tryfuran resistant ryegrass in them. Okay, so all of the worst cases in that were Tryfuran resistant. But you notice that we also got very good control. So in the right environment, particularly in environments where rainfall tends to occur towards the front end of the season, and you don't get too much later on. So in those drier environments in particular, Tryfuran is probably one of your best products, provided you don't have resistance. The next one's Avedex Extra, and this is the rate that will come on label in the next 12 months or so. So it's a ryegrass rate, not your 1.6 or 2 litre rate that we're using for wild oats. And I think the message to take home from that is that Avedex Extra can be a bit hit and miss. We really didn't get the same high levels of control that we do with Tryfuran. It didn't get as bad, but then we don't have resistance. And for a standalone, unless you've got very low ryegrass populations, I don't think it's our preferred way of using Avedex Extra. I think that we're going to get much, much more value out of that as a mixing partner. And I'll talk about that as we move on. The next one's BoxaGold. Now, the thing to remember about BoxaGold here is we do all of this in high rainfall areas, and BoxaGold doesn't have a lot of persistence. So in seasons where we've had good early rain and then a dry spring, BoxaGold has been the ideal pre-emergent herbicide for that sort of situation. So it's a herbicide that's probably more suited towards those drier environments as a standalone than it is to the very wet environments. And part of the reason why we actually started the work we're doing here was because the growers in those high rainfall environments were complaining to us about how well BoxaGold worked. So we can get very good control, but if we get a lot of rainfall and we get a lot of late germinations, BoxaGold can be pretty poor. So BoxaGold on its own, probably better for those drier, lower rainfall environments. In those higher rainfall environments, we want to have something else. Sakura has been pretty good in most environments that we've worked in. You'll notice that it's only a single trial there, but you can get situations where it doesn't work as well. And we had one trial there where it didn't perform very well. And that was one of, I think was one of those, from memory, one of those sites where we had very heavy rain, very light soils, and we lost a lot of it from that early rain. But by and large, Sakura has been pretty good in these high rainfall environments. It's, as I mentioned earlier, its real Achilles heel is in the more dry situations where there's been early rain and then the surface dries out. So under those circumstances, you're better using BoxaGold than using Sakura. And then we get into mixtures with Avedex. So Tryfuran plus Avedex is a common mixture around the place. It's if you don't have Tryfuran resistance, it's a very, very good mixture, and it's probably the ideal product for those lower rainfall environments where you want to get some extra ryegrass control, or you've got a few wild oats. It's probably your best bet there. Where you've got Tryfuran resistance, if you've got really strong Tryfuran resistance, which that bottom one there is, it's not going to work. There's no point in trying it. If you don't have too much ryegrass and you only got a little bit of resistance, it's probably okay. BoxaGold with Avedex Extra, that improved BoxaGold's performance despite the fact that they're the same mode of action. And we just ended up getting a little bit of extra control out of that. We did suffer in those really areas where we had very, very high rainfall because BoxaGold A disappeared out of the profile a bit, and secondly, we lost it. It was too short term, but you know, it's a useful mixture and mostly worked pretty well. Sakura Avedex has been probably the standout in all our early trials in terms of pre-emergent herbicides. It's a pretty expensive option, so it's not the sort of thing that you're going to do in some of those low rainfall environments. It's much more suited to the higher rainfall environments. And, you know, and I think if in those sort of 4-ton wheat areas and above, it's probably the starting point. It's probably the, you know, the initial position to go to would be to say, well, Sakura plus Avedex is where to start there. Then we've, in this trial, we worked with a use pattern which is now going to be registered. It'll get registered this year, I think, in time for seeding, and this is BoxaGold as a Postemergent. Now, there's The reason we can use BoxaGold as a post-emergent is because it has that water solubility that things like Sakura, Rustler, not that we'd use Rustler in wheat, Tryfuran, and Avadex just don't have. Okay, so you can't use those as a post-emergent, but you can get away with BoxaGold provided you get rainfall after you've used it. If you don't get rainfall, it won't work. Now, we did these trials in these high rainfall environments where you get frequent rainfall events, so we're more or less guaranteed that we're going to get a rainfall event after using BoxaGold. So that's where we went. So this is a high rainfall environment use pattern we're talking about, and you'll notice what we didn't do was BoxaGold Post on its own. And, you know, that I think is, if we're going to get a really good use out of pre-emergent herbicides, that's probably not the best way to use BoxaGold. So Tryfuran pre-BoxaGold Post, despite the fact that we had Tryfuran resistance, that was a very good treatment. It worked pretty well in most environments. Avadex Extra pre-BoxaGold Post really wasn't that much better than using Avadex on its own. So that one was one for reasons that we don't really understand very well, just didn't work. And so I wouldn't recommend that as being a strategy to use. So if we're going to go BoxaGold Post, I think it's either going to be Tryfuran or it's going to be Sakura. The last one is the Sakura pre-BoxaGold Post. That, of course, is our most expensive option, but you can see how well it worked in these really high rainfall environments. So it was a very, very good performer across all of those environments. Even when we tended to lose the Sakura a bit because of that high early rainfall, we were able to pick up those ryegrass plants that came through with the BoxaGold, and then anything that was left, Sakura got later. So that was really the standout product in these trials. And again, I'll mention that these were very high rainfall zones. So if you're in a low rainfall zone, Tryfuran and Avadex are probably things to be thinking about. If you've used a lot of Tryfuran or have Tryfuran resistance, then you want to go to BoxaGold Avadex, and in those really higher rainfall areas, Sakura Avadex is your starting point. But think about the ability to go Sakura pre and BoxaGold Post, really just to get that extra ryegrass. And the last thing I want to say about this slide, just notice what that is. We're talking about reduction in ryegrass spike numbers, so seed heads, at the end of the season. So we're looking here at trying to get pre-emergent herbicides to do season-long control of ryegrass. And then, of course, if you don't have too many seed heads at the end and you've got some seed control tactics operating in there, that's a real way that you can actually drive these numbers down pretty effectively.
So Chris, you're starting to touch on it there. I've travelled to some of these high rainfall areas that you talk about, and I've been a little bit horrified, to be honest, to hear the growers talk about their strategy being Sakura Pre and BoxaGold Post, which, as you say, is all well and good if you're towing a chaff cart or burning a windrow or whatever harvest weed seed control tactic comes in behind it. But a lot of these growers weren't doing anything afterwards. You know, is that a fast track to breaking two really good herbicides pretty quickly, or is it do you think it's not, am I being a bit alarmist there, or are we going to break them pretty quickly going Sakura Pre BoxaGold Post?
Well, I think the biggest risk we have around that use pattern is going to be around BoxaGold use, because we can only use Sakura in our wheat, and so the Sakura Pre BoxaGold Post is going to be in that wheat phase. Other tactics are going to have to be used in every other phase. So we're not talking about this being used year in, year out. It might get used 1 or 2 years in 4. The trouble we might end up with is that then people, if they move to barley and decide that they're going to do BoxaGold in barley. And so if we have a rotation where you don't have a lot of break crops in your rotation and you're growing a lot of wheat and barley back to back, well, there might be a lot of BoxaGold use. And then if that's the circumstance, I think that we probably need to rethink how we're going to use our Sakura there, and it's probably going to be Sakura Avadex would be your best option for your wheat to save your BoxaGold for your barley. So it's all about rotations and the other tactics you've got into play. Because, of course, if you're growing enough break crops, then you're not using any of this chemistry other than Tryfuran. Really, you've got other chemistry in your break crop, so you take some of the pressure off. So I think it's a combination of getting a rotation right, thinking about how you're using your products, getting the best out of your products when you can, and this is why we're saying in these high rainfall zones that just going out with Sakura alone is not good enough, because you're not getting enough weed control. So your other tactics are just not getting that extra bit you really need to get your numbers down. So you've got to go hard, you've got to use those other tactics, you've got to drive your numbers down. Once your numbers are down, life becomes a whole lot easier. And so this is part of that, getting your numbers down.
Now, Chris, this slide has triggered a few questions, so if we can go through a few questions in a row. Just the last question that came in is, what's the risk of crop damage with BoxaGold Postemergent, and is there any difference in disc versus time in that situation?
Okay, so the risk about BoxaGold Post is it does carry a risk of crop damage. It's because you're going at the 2 to 3 leaf stage of your crop is actually more tolerant of BoxaGold at that stage than when it's emerging. So typically with this use pattern, we actually tend to see less crop damage with the post-emergent than we do with the pre-emergent use. That doesn't mean you don't get crop damage, but we tend to see less. It's certainly, we played around a bit with post-so pre-emergent, and I can tell you that the reason the label says 3/4 of a litre post-so pre-emergent is that's probably the worst time to put out a big amount of BoxaGold, because if you get heavy rainfall on top of that, that'll go straight down to your crop seed. So we've tended to find that, generally speaking, wheat's been pretty safe. Can get some issues if you get really heavy rainfall. So if you get an inch of rainfall after putting it out, that'll drive some of it down to your seed row. It's likely to be a bit more risky in disc seeders than it will be in certain disc seeders than it will be in some tine seeders. But even in tine seeders, it can be a bit risky because you're putting it right on top of that seed there. The disc situations where it's probably worst are going to be where you don't close the slot. So we've seen some disc setups that don't actually adequately close the slot on top of the seed. If your disc system's doing that, so go out and look afterwards and make sure there's good covering on top of the seed. If you're just not closing it, putting BoxaGold on top of it's probably going to give you some crop damage. But again, mostly we don't tend to see so much. We think it's a little bit safer than putting it up front in terms of crop damage. It's not quite so, it's certainly less risky for weed control to put it up front. So I wouldn't be recommending that you don't do anything and then decide you're going to come back and try and get your weeds with BoxaGold. We're using BoxaGold here quite deliberately to try and get extra weed control. So it doesn't. None of these pre-emergent herbicides come without risk, but that one's probably a fairly low risk. You'll see crop damage some of the time, but mostly not.
And some more questions, Chris. There was another one about how shallow is too shallow. I think this was referring to your slide earlier where you had crop damage from shallow sown crop. So how shallow is too shallow for wheat?
Well, I think that in those ones where we were going shallow, we were sort of 2 centimetres and under. If you're over 3 centimetres, you're down at about 3 centimetres, you're pretty safe from that too shallow component.
The good old edge of a matchbox to the height of the matchbox.
Yeah, no, it's the old story. So what we did was we set the gear up so that it was sowing shallow to try and mimic that, that sort of operation where you don't get the setting right, or you're going too fast and it's tending to pull out of the ground a bit. And what happens is that you end up with your crop seed just too close to your herbicide.
Yeah. Now, we've got about 15 minutes left, Chris. There was a question about disc planters earlier, which I didn't ask you because I was wondering if you're heading in that direction, or were you not planning on covering disc planters?
I was only going to plan on covering discs around questions rather than actually show a lot of data.
Yeah, so the question was the single versus double versus triple disc for the pre-emergence. Any observations there?
Look, if we go back and think about where we might get crop damage, you know, the worst circumstances where we'll get crop damage is where we've got our herbicides too close to our crop seed. So if we can move that herbicide-treated soil from on top of the row, then we're going to minimise our risk of crop damage. So triple discs do that, by and large, do that pretty effectively. When we start getting down to single discs, we find that they don't. So we can certainly, with most of our pre-emergent herbicides, we can dial up crop damage with a single disc. There's no difficulty in doing that at all. We've actually just done some, or finished some work that GRDC funded that asked the question, how do you set your disc up to minimise crop damage from pre-emergent herbicides? And the answer is that you move some soil from on top of the seed. And the only issue in closing is if you don't close the slot. But the closing end, regardless of what we tried at the closing end, we really didn't get a lot of crop damage. So it was all about what you were doing up front. So that if you just put a single disc through, low disturbance, we got crop damage. When we put a wavy coulter on the front of that, it was like a knife point. We got minimal crop damage.
Yeah.
So a coulter in front, so this is where your triple discs are going to not give you any crop damage, or we actually used a ground engaging residue manager, like an Arix wheel, but we actually made it work in the soil. So opposed to just taking the residue off, you know, we were working that off probably about 0.5 centimetre, 5 millimetres in the soil. And in fact, that was enough to minimise most of your crop damage.
Yeah, it seems to me there's been a bit of a trade-off there. A lot of people move to discs to minimise that amount of soil disturbance, don't they? But your work is sort of saying that if you minimise the disturbance too far, you can end up with crop damage from the pre-ems, and you're actually setting disc seeders up to disturb the soil more than perhaps the farmer ideally would like to. So I guess it's a trade-off between weed control and your no-till ideals sometimes, I guess.
Well, this one with pre-emergent herbicides, it just simply has to be. You know, we're relying on pre-emergent herbicides to get our grass weeds in our cereal crops. We just have to make that compromise because otherwise we're going to get crop damage.
Now,
and I've seen enough examples of that where people got it wrong.
Yeah. We'll just do one more question, or sort of two related questions. There's been a question about using really high water rates for pre-ems, and there was also a question earlier about stubble loads and do the different pre-ems have different binding to stubble. So I think they're probably both related. I just wonder if you'd like to tackle that.
Okay, so the stubble, you know, products like Tryfuran bind very tightly to stubble, and basically you lose it. It's on the stubble, and you're not using that, which is why, you know, we've actually increased the rate of Tryfuran we use, because we're losing all this stuff on stubble. We're losing some by not incorporating it properly. We need to have enough to actually kill the weeds. BoxaGold and Sakura are more water soluble and do tend to wash off stubble. But even then, you know, stubble is different. We find, generally speaking, that in standing stubble, provided all the stubble's standing, then it doesn't matter how much stubble you've got, you'll be able to use products like BoxaGold and Sakura effectively. But if that stubble's down on the ground, so you've cut it short and dropped it all on the ground, or you've had sheep in and trampled it all on the ground, or whatever it might be, and you end up with a mat of stubble on the ground, what you're going to do is you're going to separate these herbicides from the weed seed, because the weed seed will fall to the bottom. And you're putting the herbicide on top of the stubble, the weed seed's down the bottom. It's going to take time for that herbicide to wash down. BoxaGold we'll find will wash down, but we can have some issues there over the weeds will actually get away before the BoxaGold gets there. So, you know, you don't want to have total coverage of stubble and try and use BoxaGold. With Sakura, we know it's a good way to stop Sakura from working because it's not as water soluble as BoxaGold. So if you've got a nice mat of stubble, or as some people have found, if they've gone out and done windrow burning and haven't burnt their windrows right to the ground, you'll stop Sakura working in those circumstances because it's just separated from those seeds. So I think the rule is if you end up with too much stubble, you've got to get rid of it. If you can leave it standing, it's better, but if it's down on the deck, you just have to get rid of it to get these products to work. Tryfuran's the worst, but even with products like BoxaGold, which will wash off stubble, if you've got 100% ground cover of stubble, you can expect that it won't work as well. Yeah. If you've got standing stubble, one of the good ways, of course, of getting it, because when you think about herbicides, pre-emergent herbicides, what you want to do is hit ground. So one of the good ways of dealing with standing stubble and pre-emergent herbicides is large droplets and high water rates. So you really force those droplets down onto the ground rather than having them sort of drift onto the stubble and stick to the stubble.
So does the large droplets and high water rates work regardless of stubble? Is that, if you had bare soil, would that still be the best practice?
Well, I mean, you get more coverage out of it. But if you got bare soil, you don't necessarily need quite the same size of droplet and water rate. But I think generally speaking, pre-emergent herbicides going out before seeding, coarse droplets is where you are. It's where you want to be.
Exactly. Okay, Chris, we've got about
the best.
Sorry.
Yes, better.
We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. Sorry, I'll cut you off there. Yeah, we might need to just move on and just, I don't know if you're going to get through all of your slides, but
it doesn't matter. I've only got some pictures now, I think.
Okay, maybe if we just run through a couple of those, we'll leave the questions alone for a couple of minutes, and then, yeah, then we'll try and wind it up on the hour as we planned.
Okay, so this is an example out of the work that we were doing. This is a pre-emergent herbicide that has too little persistence. So this is BoxaGold in a very high rainfall environment. So the wheat's got away really well, but you've got a lot of little ryegrass growing in under the crop there. And so that's come up later after the persistence of the product's gone. And that's why in this environment we were thinking about, instead of putting BoxaGold up front, whether we can actually use it as a post-emergent. And I think the last topic I want to talk about is the fact that pre-emergent herbicides, to get their best, need crop competition. So this is some of our canola work we've been doing with Ruff. We've got a TT on the left there. We've got a Clearfield hybrid on the right, and they were sown the same day. A photograph was taken on the same day, and you can see that one we've got ground cover, one we don't. We've had very good effect of our pre-emergent herbicide, but you can just see in that really open TT canopy, we're getting a lot of little ryegrass just coming through there that have tended to avoid the rustler. Quite a lot of that's in the row, which is what we notice from that particular herbicide. So getting crop competition really helps your pre-emergent herbicides. This last one is some work that we've been doing with the Hart Field Site group, looking at how do you actually think about using pre-emergent herbicides when that's what you're relying on, and have we been doing the right thing? And here we really looked at sowing date. So these were two crops. They were sown, I think from memory, a month apart, and they all had the same herbicide treatments over them. And on the left we've got the early sown crop there, and you see there's a lot of ryegrass in that crop there, but you notice that a lot of the ryegrass is actually quite low in the canopy. We look at the later sown crop. The ryegrass is actually at this stage is starting to get up over the canopy. And what we're finding is that as we're getting into that sowing window, it's getting colder and colder, that early sowing of these cereals, the crop bounces out of the ground, you get some good competition against your weeds, which you've suppressed with your pre-emergent herbicide, and those later germinators aren't actually having as much impact on your crop. And again, if we can have something at the end of the season to deal with those, we'll have quite a successful little system. Going in late, you're going to end up where the crop is growing sluggishly. Ryegrass doesn't mind it getting cold and wet. It'll continue to grow, and it in fact outgrows the crop. And that's where we seem to end up with our worst problems. So we've had this idea, we've been talking to growers for 2 decades now, sow your dirty paddocks last so you can get an extra knockdown on them and get rid of some more weeds. But that was in the days when we had post-emergent herbicides, and we could pick when we put the product out to get the weeds. I think in the pre-emergent herbicide era, we might have to rethink some of that. And maybe what we should be doing is sowing our clean paddocks last if we're just relying on pre-emergent herbicides, so that we don't actually have to rely so much on that crop competition to do the work for us. Or alternatively, get some more crop competition into the system.
Right.
So that was the last point I wanted to touch on, Peter.
That's a wonderful bombshell to finish on, Chris. I couldn't agree more, actually, and I think that sums it up beautifully, that it's that early competition from an early sown crop with a pre-em that's been activated by good opening rains is the best case scenario. So yeah, I completely agree with you there, and yeah, I think that'd be my observations from the field as well. And yeah, like you say, we probably need to continue to back that up with research, but I would assume that a lot of the growers out there would say similar things, and a lot of the growers I speak to have a very good integrated system where they're running their seed bank down continuously. They have low numbers, they early sow, and they use a robust pre-em package, and they have good crop competition, and that's the package, isn't it?
That's the package, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a perfect segue to advertise next week's webinar from Deirdre Lamel from Charles Sturt University at Wagga. Deirdre's had a lifetime of researching crop competition, and she's going to share that with us next week. I'll actually be in Wagga with Deirdre to host that webinar. We'll do, I think it's on at a different time. I think it's going to be around about lunchtime Eastern Standard Time, and we'll be very similar format to this one with a little bit of interview style. But so that's next week, and we'll be talking the crop competition side of things, which goes with obviously your robust pre-em package. Today's been a lot about herbicides, of course, and we need to. Herbicides are part of the solution, of course, and having non-herbicide tools like crop competition is the other important part. So thank you very much, Chris, for sharing your insights there. Good to always hear that high-end stuff about the properties of the various products and their the chemical properties, and then how that relates to the soil, and then you've obviously backed that up with trial data on the weeds. So we've heard from that scientific level of the chemical properties through to their efficacy, and very valuable. So thank you very much for your time, Chris. And yeah, and I guess there's potentially an opportunity to ask Chris more questions through WeedSmart. We do have an Ask an Expert column in there. You should be able to find it on the WeedSmart website. Hopefully that's still working now that I've opened my mouth. But thanks everyone for attending, and we'll hopefully look forward to some of you attending next week to hear from Deirdre Lamel as well. Thank you very much.